Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here once again, I must say, in Tallinn, which is a city very familiar to me now. I would like to begin with some definitions in order to frame the whole matter. The first one is the definition we use in our studies on cyber, and it's a very, as you can see, a very comprehensive, very broad notion which tries to encompass all the aspects. That means not to separate, not to oppose, but rather to combine all the elements, military, civilians, and not necessarily to reconcile, but to bring together some key issues such as individual rights, privacy, economic freedom, and of course, security. Here, again, a very general, very broad definition of information, which will allow us to go further and to consider the two main areas of my speech, which are obviously propaganda and disinformation in cyberspace. I would like to stress the fact that propaganda, no matter if you like it or not, propaganda is overt, is a narrative which pretends to substitute for reality and information. Propaganda pretends to offer a vision of the world sometimes, a vision of a given situation, and propose overtly an interpretation of reality. On the contrary, disinformation is a covert operation aimed at creating a false belief and aimed at inducing leaders to make wrong decisions contrary to their real interests. Disinformation is close to black propaganda. It's not exactly the same thing. But because, if I may say so, the beauty of good, efficient disinformation is that you don't know that there is disinformation. And all of us, we don't know that we are probably living and have been living for years with pieces of disinformation. And we are not aware of that. That's real, good disinformation. If I can say this is disinformation, if I can make the demonstration that it is disinformation, disinformation has failed to some extent. Now, I would like to, in this general framework, I would like to make the distinction between the two notions of propaganda, disinformation. As we have seen, one is overt aggression or overt action. The other is covert. How do you protect? You can protect with overt information against propaganda. You can also protect against disinformation through identification of the disinformation activity or and the attribution of the source, and counter disinformation with information. What are the wrong actions? Wrong actions are to try to make and to diffuse counter-propaganda. And in the field of disinformation, the same symmetric approach is and can be considered, and I will explain further, wrong action if you try to organize and to launch a parallel disinformation campaign. Now, it is important, particularly nowadays, to consider the importance of propaganda and disinformation in the framework of what is now what we call hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is characterized by the massive use on a massive scale of propaganda and disinformation. A key goal is the acquisition of media superiority, including most of the activities in cyberspace. It is not necessarily cyber dominance, but is certainly the search for cyber superiority. Is it new? Not really, because all civil wars, and you can think about Ukraine as a civil war, you can think about Syria as a civil war, and all those activities related to insurgency and counterinsurgency have always been about hearts and mind. Therefore, propaganda is a key element, and the maneuver to respond to propaganda and disinformation are one of the major goals in dealing with hybrid warfare. Now, let's have a look to Russia, and let's have a look to Russian activities in the war in Ukraine. Here I will talk about war in Ukraine, and certainly not about crisis. We are facing a war with already more than 6,000 people dead, and this is not a crisis. And we must consider propaganda and disinformation in the framework of a war. The characteristics of Russian activities are the mastering of the PSYOPs tempo. Always, or almost always, Russia propaganda has got the initiative and has many times, most of the time, created surprise. The Russian government has used an enormous quantity of propaganda and disinformation, regardless sometimes of the quality. It has created a massive, massive blow related to the information sphere. Having doing that, the Russian activity in the infosphere is characterized also by a great diversity, and we must recognize a great creativity. The targeting is, I would say, a classic one. Western and Eastern Ukraine as a whole, the Russian people, in the case of disinformation and propaganda, your own people is always one of the major, if not the major target. of course, EU opinion, and also pro-Russian groups and networks in European countries. Those groups are working and are still working as influence agents in favor of the Russian point of view and diffusing in the West the Russian piece of propaganda. Let's look at the main themes. Western Ukraine is under the oppression and manipulated by fascism. There is a US-EU NATO conspiracy as Ukraine as a whole, especially the conspiracy of the EU to impoverish the Ukrainian population and open the Ukrainian market for the Western European goods. The whole conspiracy is directed by the so-called Euro plutocrats, and there is in New York a traditional Jewish Wall Street lobby. This is propaganda which is dispatched all over Ukraine and all over, of course, Russia. Propaganda and disinformation are using also very rude and almost incredible news, such as the torture of civilians, including children. The case has been made that the Ukrainian army had crucified several children, which is related to a very deeply rooted symbolism. And it looks like an incredible story. In reality, this story has an impact because it has references which are rooted in the symbolism of the cross. And among the themes, there is also the fact that Russian media are under permanent attack from the Ukrainian army, attack by the Western media, and particularly the fact that Russian journalists are in danger while they are doing their job in the western part of Ukraine. The tools and techniques are many. The blunt denial of reality, this is not true. You are showing clues. They are not valid. We don't recognize them. The use of selected photography, the diversity of angles. For instance, politicians in Western Ukraine are just photographed when they are, for instance, raising their arm. And it can be considered some kind of fascist salute. Classical technique also is the comment of an image. You see an image with white trucks coming from Russia. They are stopped, and the voice of command saying, well, the humanitarian assistance is blocked at the border by the Ukrainian army, and so on and so forth. There are not real innovation in cyberspace. There have been traditional use of defacing. There has been a limited use of DDoS. But the dispatching of propaganda requires to keep an open access to the internet. That's some kind of paradox. If you want to dispatch propaganda and disinformation, you cannot totally disrupt the communication devices of your adversary. So the internet must remain relatively safe and accessible. It makes a big difference from the strategy of the Syrian Electronic Army. That organization, supported by the government of Bashar al-Assad, has focused on attacking deliberately and shutting down the cyber activities and the cyber capabilities of the rebellion. In the case of Ukraine, one of the major activity of the Russian army has been the disabling of the command and control between Kiev and Crimea during the period of the conquest of Crimea by the Russian army. I give you a short example of a piece of disinformation, which is the story related by the Russian media Sputnik News about the Lviv mutiny. If you look at that piece of information, you will see that there are no sources and that the elements are very vague. By hundreds, how many we don't know, according to local media reports. Which media? We don't know. And the spokesman for the mutiny outrage, the so-called outrage military man, is unknown. So that's the kind of disinformation that you can find very easily. What the response, building an information communication strategy is necessary. It is important to convey fair information and, again, make sure that there is no symmetry. Propaganda is one thing, and countering propaganda is not counter-propaganda. And one of the key goals is, of course, to clean and restore the brain of your own people. The question is what you do in cyberspace. Do you want, against propaganda and disinformation, to stop and to close, or do you want to compete? I think it's in the nature of democracy to organize information in order to compete and to prevail in the field of information. So when it comes to the response of EU and NATO, let's make sure that we are not making the mistake of organizing some kind of counter-propaganda or parallel disinformation. The problem with the EU is the lack of experience in that business. There is no such thing like Voice of Europe. I don't know if you are familiar with Euronews, but I don't see exactly how Euronews could do the business or be reorganized in order to counter and to respond with fair information to the propaganda of Russia. There are, by the way, different views inside the EU about the role of Russia in Ukraine. There is no cyber strategy, and ultimately, there is very scarce money. The EU now is focusing on serious organized crime and terrorism, which is important, but which is not enough. The EU is implementing a new structure in order to oppose and penalize violent propaganda, racial hatred, but so far they have faced very rude and very, let's say, unfair and not very well-crafted propaganda. Once the terrorist organization would have acquired lawyers in order to adapt to the legislation, it would become very different. As a result, what is the help of the EU towards Ukraine in the field of information? It's not exactly the same thing with NATO. However, NATO is limited to some help from, for instance, Romania, a member of NATO, to Ukraine. But what about NATO as a whole? So there are a number of problems which has to be solved. NATO has to be more active and not only reactive, and it has to be able to prevent propaganda. That's also another issue which is important. You have to be able to think about what your adversary is preparing. That means you have to be ready to face a propaganda or a disinformation campaign and be able to respond with the right and the efficient information. So how to do that? It came to my mind that it would be possible to consider a new center of excellence, center of excellence for information. Another option would be to locate this particular activities here in Tallinn, in the center of excellence, which already exists. One final comment is that the number of actors is very limited, and the number of tools is also very limited. Can we think of a role of ICANN? It's not really its job, unless people try to think about it and to change a little bit the scope of that organization. More promising is certainly the role of CERTs. CERTs have a spirit of transnationalism. They are not supposed to act in favor of a specific country against another country. However, we have seen the experience of CERTs helping Estonia during the 2007 attack. And it seems to me that in cyber, the CERTs can be organized, connected in order to support information and right information and counter disinformation campaigns in cyberspace. That's it. And I think the last word is we can trust the truth, we can trust the information, fair information. At the same time, we have to think about organizing ourselves for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Giré.